We're going to show you the ways that you can create blueprints inside of Unreal Engine 4, as there are quite a few different ways that you can go about doing it. We'll also take a tour of the Blueprint Editor UI so that we have a better understanding of what each area is and what it is used for. Now that we're inside the editor, let's go ahead and create our first blueprint. Now there's a couple different ways that we can do this. Probably the most common way is through the content browser here. We're going to go to the Add New button. This is going to give us the ability to add all kinds of different assets, including the blueprint asset, so the blueprint class. If we select this, we're going to get the ability to pick a parent class that we want to base our new blueprint off of. Parent classes, again, as a bit of a refresher, allow us to inherit some functionality from whatever class it is that we select. Now, most of the time, you're going to be using actor classes, as these are things that can be placed inside the level, but there's all kinds of different classes that you can choose from. In fact, you can expand all classes and you can get a sense of how many different types of classes there are, as well as the different actor classes that you can base your blueprint off of as well. So for this particular example, all we're going to do is select actor. So once we select actor, it's going to create an asset in the content browser, which allows us to rename the blueprint to whatever we want. So we'll call this test blueprint. I think so, test BP. Let's go ahead and open this blueprint up and take a look at the Blueprint Editor UI. So once we double click and open that up, we are now inside of the Blueprint Editor. And we'll come back to the different types of ways that you can create blueprints in a moment. Let's take a quick tour of the Blueprint Editor UI. Now don't get alarmed, there's all kinds of buttons and options and things in here. We're going to step through this here together and talk about each of the different panels and what they do. First and foremost, we'll start in the upper left. We have the Components panel. And this allows us to add all kinds of different components. These are the bits and pieces that make up our blueprint. So we can add audio, we can add particle effects, we can add skeletal or static meshes, we can add cameras, all kinds of different components that we can add. And each of those components have some built-in functionality already that we can tap into. Directly to the right of that, we have the main toolbar here across the top, which gives us the ability to compile our blueprints. Whenever we're working inside of our blueprints, before we go and test them in the editor, we want to compile and make sure that there's no errors before we try to test something out. We can also save our blueprint from here, browse to it, and find it inside of the content browser by clicking this button. The Find button here allows us to find any references that this blueprint is being used by. We also have class settings, which gives us the ability to define class-specific settings for this particular blueprint, as well as class defaults. Now, these are the default properties for this particular blueprint. And we'll get into this a little bit more when we start talking about variables down the road, how you can set up your variables and access them from the class defaults option. Directly to the right of that, we have simulation and play, so we can simulate our blueprint or play and see our blueprint running directly from these two options here. This little drop down here allows us to debug different instances of our blueprint. So if we have multiple light blueprints in our level, and we want to debug one of them, we can click this drop down. They will all get populated here, and we can choose which one we want to debug at any given time. To the right of that, we have the Details panel. This is where all the properties are that we can define and make adjustments to. It is context sensitive, so if we have different things selected, different properties will be displayed here. For example, if we added some components, so if we added a static mesh, which we can search for from the search window up here, can select that static mesh, and now we can define properties for that static mesh, such as the location, rotation, and scale. We can actually define what the static mesh is, so we could say cube, for example, something like this. So here we have a cube inside our blueprint. We could add additional components such as lights, for example. So we can add a point light, and that light, we can move it up. We can come in and change the light color, etc. So these are all the properties that you can define inside of the Details panel. Kind of been working in it already, but to the left of that, we have our viewport. This is where you can come and see all of those components that you've added. So for example, if you had something like a car, so you'd have all kinds of different meshes for the car, you could see that and put that together inside of the viewport panel here. The viewport panel is broken up. This intersection is broken up into 3 tabs, I should say. The viewport is the default tab. But we also have the construction script, and what this essentially does is allow us to set up customizable parameters or prefabs of this blueprint. This is very useful if you have level artists that are setting up your levels and you have blueprints inside of your level that you don't necessarily want to enable them to modify the script, but you want them to change the value of some things, you could set up a script inside of here that exposes those values. So say, for example, the light color, we could drag this in here and say, allow the user to change the light color or intensity. And that will update inside of the editor so they can see that reflected as they're putting together their level, essentially. This fires whenever any modifications are made to this blueprint. It also fires at runtime when the game begins. Directly to the right of that, the third and final tab, is the event graph. This graph is used for updating Blueprint script at runtime. So while the application's actually running, this is where you're going to be doing most of your scripting, is probably in here, as this is the moment-to-moment script that is being run. Over to the left, we have the My Blueprint panel. This is where you can see all your different graphs that you have, any functions that you create. You can actually create them here or override functions or see the functions that you have created. You also have the ability to create macros, which are kind of like a utility tool that you can use to streamline the way that your blueprints are set up. Variables, you can create and assign variables here. These are things that are going to change. They vary from time to time. That's the best way to think about variables. These are things that you can set up here as well. There's also event dispatchers. It's effectively a communication tool that you can use to communicate between different blueprints. So that, in a nutshell, is the Blueprint Editor UI. I'm going to close this out for a second. We've created our blueprint here. You can actually see that the thumbnail has updated and we now have a test blueprint. To bring it into our level, we could just drag it and drop it directly inside of our level. Now you can see that we have our cube and a light here, which is pretty cool. This is referencing the asset that is inside the content browser. So this isn't a one-to-one relationship. If I were to make another copy of that, this is a separate instance of this blueprint. So we can make modifications to this blueprint without it affecting this one, unless we set the script up that way that we want them to affect one another. So for example, on this particular one, I can come in and change the light to red, and you can see it's not affecting the main blueprint. Our main blueprint is still using that white light. Let's take a look at this other stand here that's completely empty. We created a blueprint from the content browser by clicking the Add New button and going to Blueprint Class. You can also right-click inside of the content browser and go to Blueprint Class as well. It's the same menu, and it'll pop up the Pick Parent Class option as well. If you go to the context menu, either from the Add New or by right-clicking, there's also, under the Create Advanced Asset section, under Blueprints, there's some additional assets that you can create in addition to the Blueprint class, which you can create from here as well. You can also create a function library, which is just a collection of functions that you can access from other blueprints. The Blueprint interface is another communication device that you can use to communicate between different blueprints. The macro library, similar to a function library, is just a collection of macros that you can use in different blueprints. Enumeration is just a named list that you can create that you can use inside of your blueprints for flow control. So for example, you could have states of a character as a enumeration, and the state of your character could be that the character is alive or dead or hurt, and you can have those as an enumeration, and then based on those different states you can switch and do different things inside of your blueprints. Structure is a collection of different variable types. So for example, if you had a character that had an inventory, for example, you could have a pickup item structure, and that structure could contain things like the name of the pickup, a thumbnail to appear inside of the UI, a static mesh to represent it inside of the world, maybe a sound effect that it plays when you pick it up, etc. All those could be contained within this structure, and they are all of different variable types. Let's take a quick look at how we can create blueprints in a slightly different approach. So before, we created in the content browser, we created the asset. Inside the asset, we added our components that make up our blueprint. Another thing you could do is you could work inside of the editor. So we could take something like a cube here, and we could take a light, for example, and we could put that on. We could just move it up, something like this. And maybe we wanted to have a trigger box, for example, that when the player enters this thing starts spinning or the light changes color. Whatever components that we want to make, we could just keep adding them to the level here. And then once we're happy, what we could do is we could select each of them by holding Control. Now that we have them all selected, I think we do. Let's double check and make sure that we do. Probably could move that out a little bit, make it easier to select. Or select it first. Then we could select that and our light. Now we have all three of those selected. What we could do is we can go up to the Blueprints button at the very top here. Second option down, aside from creating a new blueprint class, is to convert those selected components to a blueprint class. So when I select this, It's going to ask us to select a path where we want to save it. And I'll just go ahead and save it under the Blueprints folder here, under this, and point it to Finished Assets and Blueprints. And we'll just say that this is component-based BP. When we create it, it opens up the Blueprint editor for us, and you can see that it's added those components for us automatically. So it's the same manner as going through and adding them from the Components window, but it just gives you a slightly different approach if you want to build everything out first, and then once you're happy with it, then go ahead and convert it to a blueprint. Now that you know the different ways that you can create blueprints in Unreal Engine 4, I'd recommend that you go with the method that is most comfortable for you.